My name is Wren Parker, and I'm 32 years old. Last week, at my sister Madison's $200,000 wedding, held at a sprawling $15 million estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a place where the lawns are manicured with surgical precision and the air smells of sea salt and old money, I was handed a dull, gray plastic badge. It didn't have the gold foil embossing of the other guests' invites. It simply read, "Limited Access Guest." As I stood there, stunned by the cold, cheap weight of it, my mother leaned in, the cloying scent of her Chanel No. 5 hitting me like a physical blow, and whispered, "That means no plate for you, Wren. No seat at the reception, no filet mignon, just the ceremony." I felt the heavy weight of the envelope in my clutch. $10,000 I had spent 3 grueling years agonizing over. Every cent was a sacrifice I made to prove I finally belonged in this zip code. 3 years of skipped vacations to the Hamptons, or even a modest weekend in the Poconos. 3 years of home-cooked ramen, discount grocery store hauls, and brewing my own bitter coffee instead of the daily $7 Starbucks ritual that everyone else in my office took for granted. I wore the same charcoal work blazer from Target until the elbows grew shiny and the seams started to fray like my own sanity. I wanted to hand Madison the most generous gift I could possibly afford. I wanted to walk into that Greenwich estate and finally see a flicker of respect in my father's eyes. I wanted to prove that the other Parker daughter had finally made it. Instead, I was handed a laminated piece of gray garbage that told me I was effectively a ghost at my own sister's feast. I walked toward the mahogany gift table, my sensible heels clicking sharply against the white gravel driveway that cost more than my annual salary. I retrieved my envelope from the mountain of Tiffany blue boxes and said 5 words that turned my mother's expertly contoured face a ghostly shade of ash. But before I reveal the fallout of those words, if this story of family gaslighting and high society betrayal resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling me which city you're watching from and what the temperature is. I want to know where my fellow survivors are. To understand why I decided to burn that $15 million bridge, we have to go back 6 months before the Westmoreland-Parker merger. The Parker family looks flawless on a glossy Christmas card. My father, Grant, is a retired mechanical engineer who spent 35 years being a loyal cog in the machine at Boeing. My mother, Penelope, worked as a bank teller for about 5 minutes before deciding that being a professional homemaker in a high-end suburb suited her better, especially once Madison started winning every academic and social award in the state. And then there's Madison. 3 years older than me, Harvard MBA, high-flying investment banker at a cutthroat firm in Midtown Manhattan. She is the daughter who makes my parents' existence feel like a success story. The one who justifies every country club membership they ever strained to pay for. And then there's me. I'm a mid-level accountant at a small, cramped logistics firm in Long Island City, Queens. I live in a 300-square-foot studio apartment that bleeds me $1,800 a month for the luxury of a view that consists entirely of a soot-covered brick wall. I went to community college for 2 years, then transferred to a state university because my parents looked me in the eye and said they couldn't afford to send 2 daughters to elite schools. It's funny how they miraculously found the liquid assets for Madison's down payment on a luxury condo on the Upper East Side just 3 years later. Growing up, I learned that in the Parker house, Love was a commodity measured in square footage and prestige. Madison's bedroom was a suite with a walk-in closet and a vanity. Mine was a converted den with a metal rod for my clothes and 3 plastic hangers I'd scavenged from a Dollar General. When she graduated high school, they threw her a gala with a live jazz trio and a 5-course meal. When I graduated, my mother sighed and said, "We'll do something small, Wren. Low key is more your style." And then she simply forgot. But the memory that burns the brightest is the portrait on our mantle. It's a family photo from 2015. My parents and Madison are standing in front of a 10-foot tree, grinning like they just hit the Powerball. I'm not in it. My mother claimed the frame was too narrow to fit all 4 of us, so they literally cropped me out of the family history. I spent years telling myself it was just a technical error, a lack of space. I was lying to myself. The first time I truly understood that I was the limited access daughter was June 2009, my high school graduation day. I had spent 4 years grinding, Dean's List every semester, 100 volunteer hours at the local library, and pulling double shifts at a frozen yogurt shop just so I could afford my own prom dress and a pair of shoes that didn't hurt. I wasn't the valedictorian, but I was proud of what I'd built from nothing. The ceremony was set for 2 p.m. on a sweltering Tuesday. I walked across that stage at 2:47 p.m., my skin sticky under the cheap polyester gown, and shook the principal's hand. I flashed a brilliant, defiant smile for a camera I knew wasn't there. My parents weren't in the bleachers. They were 300 miles away in Morningside Heights, taking Madison on an exclusive, time-sensitive campus tour of Columbia University for her graduate studies. My mother's voice on the phone had been airy and dismissive. "Madison's future is a priority right now, Wren. You'll have other graduations." I never did. No master's degree, no law school, just the steady, silent grind of an accountant in Queens. The only person in that auditorium who showed up for me was Aunt Dorothy, my mother's younger sister. She closed her small flower shop in Hartford and drove 2 hours in a car with a failing radiator just to sit in the 3rd row and scream my name until she was hoarse. Afterward, she took me to a little hole-in-the-wall Italian joint where the wine came in carafes and the bread was warm. She handed me a card with a $100 bill tucked inside. "Your mother did the same thing to me," she said, her eyes hard as she cut into her chicken parm. "When I got engaged, she was too busy helping your grandmother reorganize her antique china cabinet to even look at my ring. She doesn't hate you, Wren. She just doesn't know how to value anything that doesn't shine in the sun." Aunt Dorothy reached across the table, her hands smelling of lilies and garden soil, and squeezed mine. "You're not missing anything, Wren. They just don't have the vision to see you yet." But I've spent 15 years waiting for that vision to clear, and as I stood on that Greenwich estate with a gray badge clipped to my chest, I realized their eyes were perfectly fine. They chose not to look. 6 months before the wedding, my phone buzzed with a notification from the family group chat, a digital space where I was a silent observer, never a participant. Madison had posted a photo of her left hand, a 3-carat cushion-cut diamond that caught the light of a Manhattan sunset on a rooftop bar. The message was short, sharp, and triumphant. "Julian proposed. The Westmoreland wedding planning starts now." Julian Westmoreland III. I'd met him twice. Once at a dinner where he spoke exclusively about his golf handicap and his family's offshore accounts, and once at Madison's birthday where he didn't even bother to learn my name. His family was old money Greenwich, the kind of people who use summer as a verb and own homes that have names instead of addresses. His father was a retired hedge fund titan, and his mother, Elizabeth, sat on the boards of 3 different museums. They were the apex predators of the social world my mother had spent her life trying to climb into. My mother's response was instantaneous. My baby! This is the happiest day of my life! My father sent a single thumbs up. I sat in my studio apartment, staring at the soot on my window, and typed out 3 different versions of a congratulatory text before settling on a neutral. Congratulations, Madison. I'm happy for you. No one liked the message. No one replied. 2 weeks later, the invitation arrived. It was thick, 600-gram cotton paper with gold leaf edges and a custom monogram that looked like a royal seal. It informed me that the wedding would be at the Westmoreland estate and that a block of rooms had been discounted to $450 a night at a nearby boutique hotel. I held that heavy, expensive paper in my hands and made a final, desperate decision. This time would be different. I would give Madison a gift so substantial, so undeniable, that my parents would have to acknowledge my worth. I would bridge the gap between Queens and Greenwich with cold, hard cash. I opened a high-yield savings account the very next day. I labeled it the wedding fund. I had no idea that while I was calculating interest and skipping meals, my mother was already calculating the most efficient way to hide me from the Westmorelands. It took me 3 grueling, soul-crushing years to scrape together that $10,000. To the trust fund babies in Julian's circle, that might sound like a rounding error or the price of a mid-range watch. But when you're pulling in a $52,000 salary before the IRS takes its pound of flesh, and you're trying to survive in the concrete jungle of New York City, every single dollar is a tactical victory. The city doesn't just take your money, it breathes it in like oxygen. I became a ghost in my own life. I stopped going out for happy hours with my coworkers in Midtown. I ghosted my friends when they suggested a modest weekend trip to a cabin in the Catskills, or even a simple Sunday brunch in Williamsburg. My life narrowed down to a series of calculated subtractions. I stopped ordering the $20 pad thai from the place on the corner and started buying bulk bags of white rice and frozen peas from the discount grocer under the subway tracks. I traded my daily $7 Starbucks ritual, that small, caffeinated luxury that made the morning commute bearable, for a chipped mug of lukewarm, home-brewed Folgers that tasted like burnt cardboard. I walked 12 blocks in the pouring rain just to save the $3 subway fare. Every time I felt my resolve weakening, I would log into my banking app and stare at the sub-account I'd labeled the wedding fund. It wasn't just a savings account. It was a scoreboard. It was my way of proving that I could play their game, that I could belong in a world that had spent 32 years trying to delete me. When winter hit the city with a vengeance, dropping the temperature to a bone-chilling 15 degrees Fahrenheit, my old wool coat, a thrift store find from my sophomore year of college, finally gave up the ghost. The silk lining tore away from the shoulder, and the hem began to unravel, trailing threads like a bandage. A normal person, a Parker, person would have walked into Nordstrom and put a new cashmere wrap on a credit card without a second thought. But I wasn't that person. I sat on my sagging, secondhand sofa in my studio apartment in Long Island City, the radiator hissing and clanking like a dying steam engine. And I sewed the frayed seams back together with a needle and a spool of cheap thread. My fingers were stiff from the cold, and the light from the single bulb overhead was flickering, but I didn't care. Every stitch was a deposit into my dignity. I wanted to walk into that Greenwich estate not as the poor sister from Queens, but as a woman who could hand over a $10,000 check without blinking. I was buying a seat at the table, one skipped meal at a time. I was building a bridge made of sacrifice, hoping it would finally be strong enough to carry me home to a family that had never really left the lights on for me. 3 weeks before the high society circus was set to begin in Connecticut, I walked into my local Chase branch. The air inside was sterile and smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and stagnant ambition. I waited in line behind a man in a bespoke suit who was complaining about a wire transfer to Zurich, and I felt a strange sense of pride. When it was my turn, I approached the teller, a young woman named Maria whose eyes looked as tired as mine felt. I requested a cashier's check for exactly $10,000. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and looked at me with a flicker of genuine surprise. Maybe she didn't see many women in scuffed boots and frayed coats moving five-figure sums around. "Would you like a formal gift envelope for that, Miss Parker?" she asked, her voice softening. I said yes. I wanted the presentation to be as flawless as the amount. I took that crisp, watermarked piece of paper back to my studio, sat at my small laminate desk that looked out onto a soot-stained brick wall, and I wrote a letter. I spent an hour on the draft, trying to find the perfect balance between warmth and distance. Dear Madison, congratulations on your big day. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, and the miles between Queens and Manhattan can feel like oceans. But I hope this helps you and Julian build a beautiful life together. Wishing you all the happiness in the world. Love, Ren. I tucked the check and the letter into the envelope, feeling the weight of 3 years of my life in my hand. Then, driven by a sudden, inexplicable surge of anxiety, I laid the envelope and the check out on my bedspread and took a high-resolution photo. I didn't know why I was doing it at the time. Maybe I just needed proof that I had actually achieved it before it vanished into the black hole of the Parker family dynamic. That same night, the phone rang. It was Penelope. I could tell by the way she said hello that she was in event coordinator mode. Her voice had that brittle, artificial sweetness that usually preceded a massive manipulation. "Ren, darling, I was just reviewing the gift registry and the seating charts, and I had a wonderful thought. Why don't you just wire the gift money to me now? I'm putting together a very large, very prestigious collective gift from the Parker family, something that will really stand out on the Westmoreland's display table. I'll just add your name to the card, and it will look so much more substantial. It would show Julian's parents that we are a unified, successful front." The subtext was so loud it was deafening. She wanted the credit for my $10,000. She wanted to use my 3 years of suffering to bolster her own status in Elizabeth Westmoreland's eyes. "I'd rather give it myself, Mom. At the wedding," In person. There was a sharp, jagged silence on the line. The kind of silence that usually happens right before a hurricane hits the coast. "Well," she snapped, the sweetness vanishing instantly. "I suppose you always were the difficult one. Fine, have it your way. Just don't blame me if your little envelope gets lost among the Tiffany boxes." She hung up without a goodbye. The warning signs were flashing in neon, but I was so desperate to be seen that I convinced myself she was just stressed about the floral arrangements. 2 months before the wedding, the bridal shower was held at the Plaza Hotel, a place where the gold leaf is as thick as the egos, and the air is perfumed with the scent of lilies and old money secrets. I wasn't invited to the planning meetings at the Upper East Side cafes. That honor was reserved for Madison's 4 best friends from Harvard, women named Harper and Sloan, who spoke in a dialect of private school acronyms and luxury vacation spots, and 2 wealthy cousins from my father's side of the family, who lived in mansions in Alpine, New Jersey. These were people I had seen maybe 3 times in my life, yet they were the ones choosing the color of the macarons and the vintage of the champagne. When I arrived, I was directed to table 14, a cramped circular table tucked away in the shadows near the service entrance. I was flanked by filler guests, distant business associates of the Westmorelands, and people who looked like they had been invited purely to ensure the room didn't have any empty seats. During the champagne toast, my mother stood up, looking regal in a custom-tailored silk suit that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes. She spoke about Madison's GPA, her career trajectory, her impeccable taste in men, and her bright future as a Westmoreland matriarch. She thanked the florist. She thanked the hotel staff. She even thanked the woman who had embroidered the napkins. She didn't mention my name once. Not as a sister, not as a daughter, not even as a guest. I sat there in the shadows, nursing a glass of lukewarm Prosecco, feeling the familiar, cold ache of being erased from my own family's history in real time. The moment that finally cracked the mask happened in the marble-lined sanctuary of the plaza's restroom. I had stepped away to splash cold water on my face and fix my makeup. I'd been fighting back a wave of nausea and tears since the second course, when the heavy mahogany door swung open. I heard the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels on the tile and the unmistakable hushed tones of high society gossip. I instinctively retreated into a stall, pulling my feet up, as I heard my mother and my Aunt Harriet approaching the vanity. The air suddenly filled with the scent of Jo Malone soap and sharpened knives. "Thank God you didn't make her a bridesmaid, Penelope," Harriet said, her voice dripping with the kind of suburban cruelty that only blooms in gated communities. "Can you imagine the photos? The Westmorelands and their friends would have spent the entire reception asking what that girl does for a living. She's an accountant in Queens isn't exactly the vibe Julian's mother is going for. It would have been a disaster." My mother let out a light, airy laugh, a sound that I had once found comforting, but now sounded like breaking glass. "I know, Harriet. Madison and I were on the same page from the start. Elizabeth Westmoreland is incredibly particular about the aesthetic of the inner circle. We couldn't have anything distracting. Wren just doesn't fit the picture we're trying to paint." I stood frozen in that stall, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Distracting. That was the word they used for me. I wasn't a human being with feelings, or a sister who had spent 3 years starving herself to buy their love. I was a blemish on a polished surface. I was a smudge on a lens that needed to be cleaned off before the cameras started rolling. I looked down at my hands, the hands of a woman who worked 45 hours a week to pay her own way, and I realized that the bridge I was building was made of air. I looked at my reflection in the small, polished metal of the stall lock, seeing the mascara beginning to run under my eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of something hotter than sadness began to stir in my gut. I should have walked out of that bathroom, grabbed my coat, and disappeared into the New York City subway system forever. But the ghost of the little girl who wanted her mom to look at her just once with pride was still pulling the strings. I told myself it was just the stress of the event. I told myself that once they saw the $10,000 check, once they saw the proof of my success, they would have no choice but to let me back into the frame. The final icy blow landed in my inbox exactly 1 week before the wedding. It was a crisp, automated Outlook notification with a subject line that read, "Rehearsal dinner guest list. Final. Strictly confidential." I opened the PDF, my eyes scanning the 40 names organized by rank and social standing. There were the Westmoreland aunts and uncles, the hedge fund partners, the Harvard bridesmaids, even Julian's college roommate who had flown in from a villa in Tuscany. My name was missing. I read the list 5 times, my brain refusing to process the omission, before I finally dialed my mother's number. My voice was shaking, but I tried to keep it steady. "Mom, I just saw the rehearsal dinner list. I'm not on it. I assume there's been a mistake with the printing?" There was a long, audible sigh on the other end, the sound of a woman who was tired of dealing with an inferior product. "Wren, darling, please don't start. The rehearsal dinner is a very intimate, very high-stakes affair. The Westmorelands are hosting, and they have a very strict capacity limit. They have board members and international clients to accommodate. There simply wasn't room for everyone." I felt a cold, hollow sensation open up in my chest. "I'm not everyone, Mom. I'm her sister. I'm your daughter." "You know what I mean, Wren. It's not personal, it's just logistics. Elizabeth wanted a very specific flow for the evening, and we had to make some difficult cuts. You'll see us at the ceremony on Saturday. Just wear something neutral and try not to make a scene." She hung up before I could reply, leaving me standing in my tiny, dark kitchen in Queens, staring at the $10,000 check on the counter, and finally beginning to realize that in the Parker family, the price of admission wasn't money. It was the total surrender of my own existence. I sat in my dark studio apartment for a long time after that phone call with my mother, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, reflecting off the soot-stained brick wall of the building next door. The $10,000 check sat on my small laminate kitchen table, looking like a glowing white beacon in the shadows. 3 years of my life were represented by that slip of paper. 3 years of hunger, of cold winters in a frayed coat, and of a loneliness so profound it had become a physical weight in my chest. And yet, I wasn't even worth a seat at a dinner table in Greenwich. I wasn't family enough to witness the rehearsal of my own sister's happiness. But even then, in the hollow silence of my Queen's apartment, some pathetic, lingering part of me still believed that the wedding day itself would be the redemption arc. I still believed that when they saw the magnitude of my sacrifice for Madison, the scales would finally fall from their eyes. I was so incredibly naive. 3 days before the wedding, my phone rang at sunset. It was Aunt Dorothy. I could hear the rhythmic snip-snip of her floral shears in the background. She was likely in the back of her shop in Hartford, surrounded by the scent of cold lilies and damp earth, the only place she ever truly felt like herself. "Wren, honey, I heard about the rehearsal dinner," she said, her voice sounding older and more weary than I'd ever heard it. I let out a long, shaky breath. "It's fine, Aunt Dorothy. It's just logistics. High society nonsense. You know how the Westmorelands are." "It is not logistics, Wren." Her voice sharpened, cutting through the static like one of her professional grade blades. "It is your mother being exactly who she has always been. And I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be honest with yourself. Do you really want to go to this wedding?" The question hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of my lungs. "Of course I do. Madison is my sister." "Madison is your sister by blood, Wren," Dorothy countered quietly. "But that doesn't mean she acts like one. And Penelope, well, your mother and I grew up in the same house, under the same roof of conditional love. I know exactly what she is capable of when she feels her status is at stake." I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window. "What do you mean?" There was a long silence, filled only by the distant sound of a siren on the BQE. "At your mother's own wedding 35 years ago, I was seated at the very last table, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. She didn't introduce me to your father's family by name. She introduced me as my sister, the one who arranges flowers. Not as a family, just as a service provider who happened to share her DNA. She doesn't hate you, Wren. She just doesn't see you as useful to the image she is trying to project to the Westmorelands. You don't fit the Parker success story she's selling to Greenwich." "So, what should I do?" I whispered into the phone. "That's not for me to decide, sweetheart." I heard her set down the shears. "But I want you to know something. I'll be at that wedding. I'll be sitting in the back, likely behind a pillar if your mother has her way, but I will be there. And if anything happens, anything at all, you won't be standing alone. Family isn't about the name on the birth certificate, Wren. It's about who shows up when the lights go out. Remember that." I felt tears prick my eyes, the first ones I'd allowed myself in weeks. "Thank you, Aunt Dorothy." I didn't know then how much I would need those words, or how quickly the lights were about to go out on the life I thought I knew. 3 days later, the night before the wedding, my phone buzzed on my nightstand at 11:47 p.m. I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind a frantic loop of anxiety. It was Sloane Reed. We'd been best friends since our freshman year at State, and by some strange twist of fate, her high-end event planning firm had been hired to coordinate Madison's wedding. She had tried to keep things professional, keeping our friendship separate from the Westmorelands' demands. But that night, her voice was trembling. "Wren, I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay incredibly calm. I'm breaking every NDA in my contract by calling you, but I can't let you walk into that house tomorrow without knowing." I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Sloane, what is it? Is Madison okay?" I was reviewing the final seating chart tonight for the reception tent, Sloane whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of her office computer. Total final check before the morning setup. 2 weeks ago, your name was on table 3, family of the bride, right next to the head table. But when I looked at the master board today, your name had been crossed out with a heavy black pen, and there's a handwritten note taped next to it. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold numbness spreading from my fingertips to my chest. What does the note say, Sloane? Read it to me. It says, guest will receive a limited access badge. No meal, no seat assignment. I couldn't breathe. The room started to spin. No meal? Sloane, are you sure? Ren, I took a photo of the note. I'm sending it to you right now. I recognize the handwriting from all the planning meetings. It's your mother's, Ren. It's Penelope's neat, perfect cursive. My phone buzzed again. I opened the image and stared at the screen, the white light blinding in the dark room. There it was. The same elegant, flowing script that had signed my birthday cards for 32 years. Guest will receive a limited access badge, no meal. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a logistics error. It was a calculated, cold-blooded execution of my dignity. My mother hadn't just forgotten about me. She had planned this with the precision of a military operation. She wanted the $10,000 check I had promised, but she didn't want me visible at the table. I was being treated like a ghost, someone who should pay their respects and then vanish into the New York night before the important people started to eat. I didn't sleep a single second that night. The panic I had felt earlier burned itself out, leaving behind something far more dangerous, a cold, hard certainty. I woke up on the morning of June 14th with a strange sense of clarity. The sun was rising over Queens, casting long, pale shadows across my studio apartment, but I didn't feel the usual weight of dread. In its place was a sharp, focused energy. I stood in front of my tiny closet, the same closet I'd been using for 4 years, and chose my outfit with the care of a soldier preparing for battle. I pulled out a navy blue dress I'd bought on clearance 2 years ago. It was simple, elegant, and understated. The kind of dress you wear when you want to look respectable, but don't want to draw fire. I did my own makeup, using neutral tones and waterproof mascara, ensuring that nothing would run if my emotions betrayed me. Then I sat at my kitchen table and began to gather my evidence. I took screenshots of every text my mother had sent me, the one where she asked me to wire the money early so she could combine our gifts, and the ones where she had gaslit me about the rehearsal dinner. I saved the photo Sloane had sent of the seating chart note. I pulled up the high-resolution photo of the $10,000 cashier's check and the letter I'd written to Madison. I organized them into a single folder on my phone, a digital dossier of betrayal. I tucked my phone into my clutch, right next to the thick, white envelope containing the check. Then I called Aunt Dorothy one last time. "I'm still going," I told her, my voice as steady as a surgeon's. "I figured you would," she replied softly. "Are you okay, Ren?" I don't know if okay is the right word, but I need to see this through. I need to watch them do it to my face. I need to see if they can look me in the eye while they hand me that gray badge. I'll be there, Ren. I'll be standing near the gift table on the east lawn. If you feel like you're losing your footing, just look for me. Thank you, Aunt Dorothy. And Ren, Whatever you decide to do today, whatever choice you make at that moment, I will support you. Even if it makes your mother hate me until the day she dies. I've lived with her disapproval for 30 years. I can handle a few more. I smiled for the first time in 24 hours, a grim, determined expression. I think she already does, Dorothy. Probably. But she's never had a reason to be truly afraid of me before. Today, she might. I hung up, picked up my clutch, and walked out of my apartment. I didn't look back at the brick wall or the soot-stained window. It was time to face the family I had spent my entire life trying to buy. The drive to Greenwich was a blur of lush green landscapes and increasingly expensive cars. As the taxi pulled off the highway and onto the winding, tree-lined roads of the Westmoreland Territory, the air seemed to grow heavier, more pressurized. This was a world of Georgian architecture, white stone columns, and manicured hedges trimmed into perfect, soulless geometric shapes. The driveway of the estate was a sweeping curve of white gravel, lined with a fleet of silver Mercedes, black Range Rovers, and vintage BMWs that probably cost more than my entire apartment building in Queens. The driver whistled as we approached the security gate. "Hell of a party, huh? Are you a friend of the bride?" "Something like that," I replied, my eyes fixed on the massive white tent glowing in the distance like a cathedral of fabric and greed. I stepped out of the taxi and walked toward the entrance, where two young men in crisp black vests stood behind a registration table draped in white silk. There were towering floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and crystal vases filled with sparkling water for the guests. On the table, organized alphabetically, were neat stacks of badges. The woman in front of me, a tall blonde woman in a silk dress that shimmered like liquid gold, gave her name and was handed a gleaming gold badge with VIP embossed on the corner. I watched her pin it to her chest with a practiced smile and disappear into the garden. "Name?" the staff member asked, his voice polite and rehearsed. "Wren Parker." He scanned his list, his finger moving down the page until it stopped. He reached under the table, away from the gold badges, and pulled out a single dull gray card. It was the color of wet concrete, designed to be invisible against a dark dress. I looked down at it. 3 words were printed in plain, utilitarian black letters. Limited access guest. "Ma'am," the young man said, his voice dropping an octave as if he were delivering bad news at a hospital. "This badge allows you access to the ceremony area only. The reception tent and the dining area require a gold level badge for entry. If you have any questions, I'm sure the hosts can—" "I'm the bride's sister," I said, my voice cold and flat. His face flickered with a momentary surge of genuine sympathy, a crack in the professional mask. "I'm incredibly sorry, ma'am. I'm just following the finalized list provided by the wedding planner's office. It was updated late last night." Before I could respond, before the anger could boil over, I felt a sharp, manicured hand clamp onto my elbow. I turned to find my mother standing there, dressed in a pale pink gown that cost more than my annual rent, her diamonds flashing in the afternoon sun. "Wren, darling," she said, a perfect, terrifying smile plastered onto her face. "Let's have a private word over the roses, shall we?" My mother pulled me toward a cluster of meticulously pruned rose bushes, far enough from the registration table that our conversation wouldn't be overheard by the arriving elite, but close enough for her to maintain that terrifying, frozen smile. "Don't you dare make a scene, Wren," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a low-frequency rage. Anyone watching would think we're just having a pleasant, emotional mother-daughter chat before the vows. Keep your face neutral." "What exactly does limited access mean, Mom?" I asked, my voice coming out steadier than I expected. I was proud of that stability. It was the sound of someone who had already hit the bottom and realized they could still breathe. She glanced over her shoulder, checking for the presence of any Westmorelands or their high-ranking associates, then leaned in close. The smell of her expensive hairspray and desperation was suffocating. "It means you can attend the ceremony, Wren. You can sit in the back and watch your sister start her life. But there is simply no room for you at the reception dinner. Julian's parents have an incredible number of high-priority guests, business partners, board members of the museum, people who actually matter to Westmoreland's future. We couldn't exactly ask a senator or a hedge fund CEO to give up their seat for—" She stopped herself, but the ghost of the sentence, "for someone like you," hung in the humid Connecticut air like a toxic fog. "You could have told me," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "Before I spent $300 on a train ticket, another $200 on a dress, and 3 years of my life on a gift." She patted my arm with a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt like a condescending strike. "Would you have come if I told you?" "No. Exactly. Look, just stay for the ceremony. Show your face so Madison doesn't look bad. Leave your gift on the mahogany table and then you can head back to the city. Madison will understand. She's very focused on her own happiness today." I looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw the woman who had surgically removed me from family portraits and whispered about my distracting presence in plaza restrooms. She stood there in her designer gown and her borrowed diamonds, asking me to donate $10,000 to a celebration I wasn't allowed to actually join. "You want my money," I said, the realization clicking into place with a visceral thud. "But you don't want me. I'm a cash cow with a gray badge." "Don't be so dramatic, Wren. It's a gala, not a family therapy session." Something in my chest set. It didn't break. It hardened into a cold, unbreakable diamond of certainty. "Okay, Mom. I won't make a scene. Not right now." She exhaled with a sigh of relief, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just stopped playing the role of the victim. I played the part of the dutiful, invisible daughter perfectly as she guided me toward the ceremony garden. The ceremony area was a triumph of high society aesthetics. Rows of white chairs stretched across a lawn that looked like it had been cut with a pair of embroidery scissors. A massive arch dripping with white roses, eucalyptus, and imported Dutch hydrangeas stood against the backdrop of the Long Island Sound. I was directed to the very last row, near the edge of the white gravel path. My chair was different from the others. It was a basic white plastic folding chair, while the first 10 rows were outfitted with plush, high-backed cushioned seats with gold leaf trim. I sat there in my clearance rack navy dress, a limited access ghost, and watched my family prepare for the happiest day of their lives. My father, Grant, stood near the front, looking stiff and uncomfortable in a tuxedo that likely cost $5,000, making small talk with Julian's father, a man whose family had owned land in Connecticut since before the Revolution. My mother circulated among the guests with the grace of a predatory shark, touching elbows, laughing at jokes she didn't understand, and making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. Everyone except me. Madison emerged from the main Georgian house in a cloud of white tulle and hand-stitched Chantilly lace. It was a Vera Wang masterpiece, $20,000 of fabric and beading that made her look like a princess from a dark fairy tale. She was beautiful. I couldn't deny that. But it was a beauty built on the exclusion of anyone who didn't fit the frame. The ceremony began with the swell of a professional string quartet. Vows were exchanged, promises of loyalty and forever that felt incredibly hollow, given the betrayal sitting in the back row. Tears were shed, mostly by my mother, who dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief she'd probably bought specifically for this photo op. When Madison and Julian finally kissed, 150 people rose to their feet and applauded. I stayed seated. I didn't clap. I just watched the spectacle with the detached gaze of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent account. Afterward, the photographer gathered the families for the formal portraits in front of the Rose Arch. Both sets of parents, the bridesmaids in their seafoam green silk, the groomsmen, and even extended relatives from the Westmoreland side who had flown in from London. "Anyone else from the family?" the photographer called out, his lens scanning the crowd. My mother didn't even look back at me. She just shook her head and adjusted Madison's veil. "No," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the lawn. "We're all here. Everyone who belongs in the photo is already in the frame." I watched them pose, grinning like a perfect, unified dynasty, and I felt a strange sense of peace. The erasure was complete. I was no longer a Parker in their eyes, which meant I was no longer bound by Parker rules. The ceremony ended with a shower of white silk petals and the quartet playing a jaunty Mendelssohn piece. Guests began drifting toward the reception tent, a massive, climate-controlled structure that glowed from within like a giant, golden lantern. Through the open silk flaps, I could see crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, tables draped in heavy ivory linen, and centerpieces that must have cost $1,000 each. The smell of seared scallops and expensive bourbon wafted toward me, a reminder of the meal I wasn't invited to eat. I stood at the edge of the garden, watching the gold badge elite disappear into that golden light. No one looked back. For a split second, the old Wren, the one who wanted to cry and hide, considered just walking away, taking her envelope and disappearing into the train station. But Wren had died the moment my mother denied my existence to the photographer. I was done being quiet. A hand touched my shoulder, and I turned to find Aunt Dorothy. She looked regal in a simple burgundy dress, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and fierce pride. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" I held up the gray card, my fingers white from gripping it. "They don't want me in the tent, Dorothy. I'm limited access." "I know," she whispered. "Sloan told me they moved the gift table to the east entrance, near the fountain. It's away from the main security line." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, Wren, do not apologize. Do not explain your worth to people who have already decided you have none. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you break." I took a deep, steadying breath. "I won't. I'm going to get my life back." I turned and walked toward the east side of the tent. The gift table was a monument to excess. white silk cascading to the grass, white peonies arranged in crystal bowls, and a mountain of boxes wrapped in paper that probably cost more than my weekly groceries. There were gifts from Tiffany and Company, Williams Sonoma, and jeweler boxes that shimmered under the garden lights. A decorative sign in gold calligraphy read, "Blessings for Madison and Julian." And there, tucked near the corner under a massive crate from a high-end appliance brand, was my plain white envelope. Waverly Parker was written on the front in the handwriting I'd practiced to look as Greenwich as possible 3 weeks ago. It was a $10,000 joke, and the punchline was my own exclusion. I reached out and slid the envelope into my clutch in one smooth, practiced motion. I wasn't stealing. I was rescinding a contract that the other party had already breached. "Wren?" My mother's voice was sharp, cutting through the music of the quartet like a serrated blade. I turned to see her standing 3 feet away, a champagne flute in her hand and fury in her eyes. Behind her, a few guests, wealthy donors to Julian's mother's charities, had turned to watch the burgeoning drama. "I asked you a question," she hissed, her face contorting. "What are you doing at the gift table? Why are you touching the envelopes?" "I'm taking back what belongs to me, Mom," I said, my voice echoing slightly off the silk walls of the tent. "The gift hasn't been given until the recipient acknowledges the giver. And since I don't exist in the family photo, I don't think my money should exist in your bank account." "You ungrateful little..." She stopped, her eyes darting to the guests who were now whispering. "Put it back, right now. This is Madison's day, and you are ruining it with your pathetic jealousy." "It's not jealousy, Penelope. It's an audit." I felt a hand brush against mine. It was Sloane passing by with a wireless headset, looking like she was managing a crisis. In one fluid motion, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm, a physical copy of the seating chart note she'd photographed. I palmed it into my clutch next to the check. "Patricia, is there a problem?" A woman's voice interrupted us, heavy with the weight of old money and natural authority. I turned to see Elizabeth Westmoreland, the mother of the groom, draped in pearls and wearing an expression of sharp, icy intelligence. My mother's face went from flushed to pale in an instant. "Everything is fine, Elizabeth. Just a small, emotional family misunderstanding. Wren was just leaving." But Elizabeth Westmoreland wasn't looking at my mother. She was looking at my gray badge. Then she looked at my clutch. Then she looked me directly in the eye. "I see," she said, her voice like velvet-covered steel. "You're the sister, the one who wasn't on the final dining list." The silence that followed was absolute. The next 30 seconds felt like an eternity. Elizabeth was evaluating the situation with the precision of a diamond merchant, and my mother was visibly vibrating with the fear of being exposed. "I have something you might find interesting, Mrs. Westmoreland," I said, reaching into my clutch. "Since we're all about transparency in this family today." My mother lunged for my arm, but I stepped back, the gray badge swinging defiantly from my dress. The audit was about to begin. The air in the garden suddenly felt thinner, as if Elizabeth Westmoreland's sharp, Arctic gaze had sucked the oxygen right out of the room. My mother stood paralyzed, her champagne flute trembling so violently that the pale liquid threatened to spill over the rim onto her silk gown. Elizabeth's eyes dropped to the folded piece of paper I held, the physical proof of my mother's calculated cruelty. You denied your own daughter a seat at her sister's wedding, while still expecting her financial contribution? Elizabeth asked, her voice dropping to a register that was both quiet and devastatingly loud in the sudden silence of the garden. That is not a misunderstanding, Patricia. That is a tactical error in character. My mother's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked like a social climber who had finally reached the top of the mountain, only to realize the ground was made of thin ice. I have the check, Mrs. Westmoreland, I said, pulling the white envelope from my clutch. $10,000. My sister and my mother wanted the investment, but they didn't want the distraction of the investor sitting at the table. So I'm taking my dividends and I'm leaving. A murmur rippled through the guests who had gathered nearby, people whose net worth was measured in the hundreds of millions, yet who still found the scenario distasteful. In the world of old money Greenwich, you can be eccentric, you can be cold, but you must never be uncouth. And treating family like a line item expense was the height of being uncouth. Just then, Madison swept toward us in a cloud of tulle, her face flushed with a mixture of bridal stress and genuine fury. "Wren, what are you doing? You're ruining my wedding day. Everyone is looking at us." I looked at my sister, the golden child of the Parker family, and for the first time, I didn't see a rival. I saw a hollow vessel of my mother's ambitions. "I'm not ruining anything, Madison. I'm just taking my limited access self and my $10,000 back to Queens. Since I'm not in the family photo and I don't have a meal ticket, I assume my presence is no longer required." Madison glanced at Elizabeth, her eyes wide with panic as she realized her new mother-in-law had witnessed the entire exchange. "Wren, please, we can find a chair. We can make room." "No," I said, my voice as firm as the white gravel beneath my feet. "You don't make room for family, Madison. Family is the foundation the room is built on. You and Mom didn't forget me. You deleted me. And once a file is deleted, you don't get to just click restore when it becomes inconvenient for your public image. Waverly Palmer, if you walk out of this estate right now, you are no longer part of this family." My mother's voice finally returned, shrill and desperate, an ugly sound that pierced the elegant atmosphere of the Westmoreland estate. I turned back one last time, my clutch tucked firmly under my arm. "Mom," I said quietly, the words feeling like a long-awaited exhale. "I haven't been part of this family for 15 years. I was just the only one who hadn't realized the membership had been revoked." The silence that followed was deafening. 150 people stood frozen, a perfect tableau of American high society, champagne flutes raised, conversations abandoned, all eyes fixed on the girl from Queens who had finally refused to be invisible. Aunt Dorothy stepped to my side, her burgundy dress a sharp contrast to the pale, artificial colors of the wedding party. She didn't say a word. She just placed her hand on my shoulder, a solid anchor in a sea of shifting status. Together, we turned our backs on the golden glow of the reception tent and walked toward the white stone pillars of the entrance. Behind us, I heard my mother break into a series of jagged, theatrical sobs. I heard Madison's voice rising to a shriek, demanding that Julian do something, though what he could possibly do was a mystery. The string quartet started playing something upbeat and frantic, a desperate attempt to restore the illusion of normalcy through sheer musical willpower. But the damage was done. The Parker success story had been audited, and the accounts were empty. We reached the front of the estate, where a yellow taxi was already waiting near the white gravel curve. I had called it that morning before I'd even left Queens. Some deep, intuitive part of me had known I wouldn't be staying for the seared scallops and the hollow toasts. "You planned ahead," Aunt Dorothy said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and respect. "I've learned that in this family, no one else plans for me, Dorothy. I have to be my own architect." We climbed into the back seat, and the driver, the same man who had dropped me off earlier, glanced at us in the rearview mirror, his eyebrows raised. "Short party, huh? Did the groom get cold feet?" "No," I said, looking out the window as the $15 million estate began to shrink into the distance. "The sister has a warm heart. Just keep driving until we hit the city line." The tears didn't come until we were halfway back to New York City, crossing the bridge that separated the curated lawns of Connecticut from the jagged, honest skyline of Queens. Aunt Dorothy sat with me in the back of that taxi, her hand never leaving mine. I didn't cry for the wedding I'd missed or the meal I didn't get to eat. I cried for the 18-year-old girl who had sat in a high school auditorium alone. I cried for the 3 years of ramen and cold coffee I'd endured to buy the approval of people who didn't even want me in their photographs. It was a messy, heaving, 32-year-old purge. "You're allowed to feel it, Wren," Dorothy whispered as the taxi hit a pothole on the BQE. "This isn't nothing. You just performed a vertical amputation of your own history. It's going to sting before it heals." The aftermath was a slow-motion collapse of the Parker family dynamic. 2 days after the wedding, I walked into my local Chase branch and voided the $10,000 cashier's check. The teller, the same Maria from before, gave me a small, knowing smile as she processed the reversal. "Change of plans?" she asked. "Better plans," I replied. That money didn't go into a gift. It went into a high-yield index fund for my own future. That same afternoon, Aunt Dorothy called me from her flower shop. "Elizabeth Westmoreland had a very long, very private conversation with Penelope after you left," she reported, the sound of her floral shears rhythmic and steady. "Apparently, Elizabeth told your mother that the Westmorelands value family legacy, and a family that hides its own daughters is a family that can't be trusted with a legacy. Your mother is currently in a health retreat in Arizona, which is social climber speak for hiding until the gossip dies down." 3 weeks after the great Greenwich implosion, my boss at the logistics firm called me into her office. Margaret was a woman who had no patience for drama, but an incredible eye for detail. "You've been distracted, Parker," she said, sliding a folder across her mahogany desk. "But your numbers are still flawless. I've been watching you grind for 3 years without a single complaint. We're opening a senior auditor position in the Manhattan office. It comes with a 12% raise and a corner window. It's yours if you want it." I walked out of her office and realized that for the first time in my life, I had achieved something that my mother couldn't claim as her own. It wasn't Parker's success. It was Wren Parker's victory. Then came the email from my father. I didn't open it for 4 days. When I finally did, sitting in my favorite Queens coffee shop with a latte I could finally afford to enjoy without guilt, the words were short and devastating. "Wren, I didn't know about the badge. I didn't ask about the seating chart. I stayed silent because staying silent was easier than fighting with your mother. I see now that my silence was a choice, and it was the wrong one. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to reply, but I wanted you to know that I see you now. I finally see the daughter I should have protected. Dad. I saved the email into a folder labeled Maybe Someday, but I didn't respond. Forgiveness is a luxury I'm not yet ready to afford him. 1 month after the wedding, I moved. I found a one-bedroom apartment in Astoria with actual closet space, a renovated kitchen, and a window that looked out onto a small neighborhood park instead of a soot-stained brick wall. The rent was significantly higher, but with my promotion and the $10,000 I'd saved, I could breathe. Aunt Dorothy drove down from Hartford to help me unpack. We spent the afternoon hanging curtains and arguing about where to put my growing collection of succulents. Around sunset, we sat on my new balcony with 2 glasses of decent wine, watching the children play in the park below. It was normal. It was quiet. It was mine. I brought you something, Dorothy said, reaching into her bag and handing me a small, silver-framed photograph. It was a shot she'd taken 15 years ago. Me at my high school graduation, clutching my diploma, smiling through the tears. I've had this on my mantle for a long time, Wren, but I think it belongs here now, in a home where the person in the photo is actually wanted. I took the frame, my fingers tracing the edges of my younger, hopeful face. Thank you, Dorothy, for everything. That's what family does, sweetheart, she said, clinking her glass against mine. The real family shows up for the graduation, and they definitely make sure there's a plate for you at the table. I've had a lot of time to think about why they did it. My mother wasn't a monster. She was a victim of her own insecurity, a woman who measured her soul in social standing. Madison wasn't evil. She was just a golden child who had been taught that her shine depended on keeping everyone else in the shadows. They were trapped in a house built on conditional love, and they couldn't even see the walls. But I'm not in that house anymore. I'm out in the fresh air of Queens, building a life that doesn't require a gold badge for entry. If you're sitting at a table where you're not being fed, where your presence is considered a distraction, or where you're being cropped out of the story, stand up, take your envelope, and walk out. The world is a lot bigger than the zip code they're trying to keep you in.